Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating and honestly pretty heavily debated. We're looking at the intersection of theology, history, and modern society. Specifically, we're unpacking Tariq Zafar's analytical critique of a rather controversial book by Robert R. Reilly called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. We're going to look at this totally objectively, laying the arguments out side by side. Our goal? To understand how some incredibly old historical ideas are literally still shaping our world today. So let's just get right into it. Has the intellectual progress of Muslims stopped? And, if it actually has, why? The central mystery we're trying to unravel today is this. Did a complex 1,200-year-old theological debate actually cause the intellectual stagnation and ideological extremism we sometimes see in modern Muslim societies? Basically, did history trap the modern mind?
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be navigating through 6 key themes today. The premise of the closed Muslim mind, fatalism versus tawakkul, the clash of reason and determinism, despotism and power, modern superstitions, and finally, ijtihad and science.
Section 1. Closing Muslim Mind, Reilly's Premise. Let's start by looking at what Robert Reilly is actually claiming here.
So here's Reilly's core premise. He argues that centuries ago, a very specific shift in Islamic theology actively rejected reason and intellect. And what did they replace it with? Strict determinism. That's the idea that God's will dictates every single microscopic event, basically making human reason completely useless. According to Reilly, this specific shift in theology is the actual root cause of the intellectual stagnation and extreme ideological movements we see right now. But here is where Tariq Zafar steps in with his critique. Now, Zafar doesn't deny the symptoms at all. He totally agrees that intellectual stagnation and pockets of extremism are very real issues today, but he strongly rejects Reilly's diagnosis. Zafar argues that the root cause absolutely isn't the religion itself. Instead, he shifts the blame entirely. He points out that what actually closed the mind were drastic real-world political shifts and what he brilliantly calls manufactured theology, basically twisted interpretations created by rulers and scholars just to hold on to power, not out of piety.
Moving on to Section 2. Fatalism and tawakkul, a core misunderstanding. This right here is where a massive theological disconnect usually happens.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core disconnect Zafar is pointing out. On one side, we have fatalism. Sitting back, putting in zero effort, dodging responsibility, and just crossing your fingers for a miracle. Zafar completely admits that many in the Muslim world have, sadly, fallen right into this trap. But on the flip side, we have the actual theological concept of tawakkul, or trust in God. This concept demands that you make the absolute maximum physical and intellectual effort first. You use every resource available to you, and only then do you trust God with the final outcome. Simply put, fatalism paralyzes progress, while tawakkul actually drives it.
In fact, Zafar points out that a genuine belief in destiny creates unparalleled courage and resilience, not apathy. If we look back at early Islamic history, figures like Tariq bin Ziyad didn't just sit around idly. No way. They made massive, almost unimaginable worldly efforts to achieve their goals. For them, faith wasn't a parking brake. It was literally rocket fuel for their actions.
So where did this intellectual paralysis actually come from? Let's get into Section 3, Reason versus Determinism, a historical clash. Buckle up, because we are diving deep into theology now.
About 1,000 years ago, two main schools of thought fiercely clashed, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari. The Mu'tazila championed radical rationalism and human free will. They argued that humans create their own actions. The Ash'ari pushed back hard with determinism, asserting that God is the direct, immediate cause of every single action. Now, Reilly claims that when the Ash'ari school eventually won this historical debate, their victory literally killed reason and ultimately closed the Muslim mind.
But Zafar counters this using this really fascinating term coined by scholar Maulana Maududi, the lathe of interpretation. Now, a lathe is a heavy machine used to carve and shape hard materials. Zafar argues that both the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari actually failed. Why? Because they prioritized Greek philosophy over simple scripture. They took their pre-existing philosophical ideas and forcefully molded or twisted religious text on this metaphorical lathe just to make them fit their arguments. The text itself didn't close their minds. Their obsession with winning a philosophical debate did.
Furthermore, Zafar critiques what he sees as Reilly's almost blind worship of human reason. Reilly treats human intellect as absolute and totally infallible, But Zafar points out, quite rightly, that human intellect is highly limited and bound by our environment. I mean, even modern science backs this up. Just think about quantum physics or the writings of Stephen Hawking. Our scientific grasp of reality is constantly shifting as we discover new things. What we considered absolute, hard scientific fact 50 years ago has drastically changed today. Reason is an incredible tool, for sure, but history constantly proves it's not some infallible metric for ultimate reality.
Let's move to Section 4, Despotism and Power, the Political Reality. Let's see how this all builds into the political landscape, because this is where Zafar believes the real lasting damage was done.
Historically, we see this tragic domino effect play out. In the early days, Islamic rule was consultative and elective, but as time marched on, it shifted into hereditary despotism, basically kings ruling by sheer force. And when that happened, independent intellect and any kind of political opposition were violently suppressed by rulers just to protect their thrones. Think about it. When all intellectual opposition is totally crushed, what happens? Violent rebellion becomes literally the only remaining way to express a political voice. Zafar makes the case that modern extremism was born in the dark shadow of this political despotism, not from the pages of a holy book.
These kings obviously needed a way to justify their brutality, right? So, they created the theory of power. It was purely a survival tactic. They demanded blind obedience and crushed any dissent, but they cleverly framed submission to their absolute power as a religious duty. This manufactured theology completely contradicted the core Islamic principles of justice and mutual consultation, and it effectively silenced the intellectual class for generations.
All right, let's jump to Section 5. Superstitions, the conspiracy trap. What actually happens to a society today when logic gets suppressed for centuries?
To really understand this, we have to look at a crucial concept called the world of causes. In Islamic thought, God created a physical universe that is governed by very specific, understandable laws, cause and effect. Understanding these laws is literally the foundation of all science. Zafar argues that when a society ignores this world of causes and just assumes God acts randomly without rules, well, that society instantly plunges headfirst into superstition.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how Zafar actually uses Riley's own example to prove his point. Riley quotes the Arab press during Hurricane Katrina, who irrationally framed the natural disaster as some sort of divine wrath, even calling the hurricane a soldier of Allah. And Zafar totally agrees with Riley here. He says this is a perfect, albeit tragic example of what happens when a society abandons the world of causes. When you completely disconnect from science and physical laws, you start treating predictable, natural weather events as targeted, mystical punishments.
And this exact disconnect leads directly into the conspiracy trap. You see, when a society is intellectually weakened, it becomes incredibly easy to just blame external forces or, hidden conspiracies for all of their societal failures. It's a psychological escape mechanism. It lets these societies avoid taking any internal responsibility for their own lack of progress. Rather than doing the hard work of building better infrastructure or advancing scientific research, it's just easier to point the finger at a shadowy enemy. It's a trap we see struggling societies fall into all over the globe today.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Ijtihad and Science, Historical Precedents. Let's explore some potential solutions.
Zafar highlights that a massive self-inflicted wound was the closing of the doors of ijtihad. Ijtihad is basically the process of using independent reasoning to solve new problems. But centuries ago, the religious establishment essentially threw their hands up and decided that all the big questions had already been answered. This led straight into taqlid, or blind imitation. Delegating all thought to a select, historical group of scholars completely paralyzed intellectual growth. It just stopped the natural evolution of ideas in a rapidly changing world dead in its tracks.
So, the crucial point we need to take away is this. It didn't have to be this way, and historically, it wasn't. Early Muslims categorically did not close their minds. Because they heavily studied that world of causes, they pioneered the very foundations of modern mathematics, physics, and medicine. Their leaders established massive institutions like Dar al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where translators were sometimes paid the weight of their translated books in solid gold. That is how highly they valued knowledge. Historically, religion and the absolute cutting-edge science of the day walked hand in hand perfectly.
This leaves us with a deeply provocative question. Are we ready to understand the world of causes again? Tariq Zafar's analysis really shows us that the closing of the mind wasn't mandated by theology at all.
It was driven by flawed political power, a tragic retreat into fatalism, and a total abandonment of scientific inquiry. The blueprint for an open, rational, and intellectually fearless society already exists in history. The real question is, are people willing to pick up the tools of intellect and unlock those doors once more? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you with plenty to think about.